Today, I'm announcing that the United States will be sending 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, the equivalent of 1 Ukrainian battalion. Secretary Austin has recommended this step because it will enhance the Ukraine's capacity to defend its territory and achieve its strategic objectives.
Is Armageddon coming? We heard Joe say it could last fall, remember? That was Biden just yesterday, delivering that address from the White House, announcing the U.S. will be providing 31 M1 Abrams tanks. Yep. Even though we're getting severe warnings from Russia. And I'm not saying you don't go right back at Russia and do the opposite of what they're telling you not to do. What I'm saying is, are we going to continue escalating this until we are in a World War III? Because that's the way it's looking, folks. The tanks not expected to reach the battlefield for months. But because the time needed to secure them and carry out training necessary, blah, 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 they wanted to make the announcement yesterday. I don't know why we don't do stuff maybe under the cover of darkness so our enemies don't know everything we're doing. Remember, Trump used to say that. Anyway, not in this stupid regime. The decision to provide the tanks marks a stunning reversal for the Biden administration, which had previously argued that Ukraine wouldn't benefit if we sent them tanks. Remember that? The decision to send the tanks helped Germany to move forward with a separate effort. They're going to provide some of their tanks to Ukraine as well. The German chancellor announcing that they're going to allow for other European nations to send other German-made tanks as well, all to Kiev to help Ukraine. White House National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications, John Kirby, briefed reporters about the announcement and was asked about them getting into the Russian hands. Because think about that. That happens. Look at Afghanistan, right? The debacle. We walk away and we don't even know where a bunch of our military equipment and the technology that's in them, who has it now? Listen to this answer, by the way.
Is there concern that if any of these tanks were to fall in Russian hands, they would have access to the latest U.S. technology?
There's always what we call tech transfer concerns, I mean, that would be the case with other systems that we have provided to Ukraine. But, and this doesn't kind of gets to the corruption question, but not really. We just haven't seen any indications that any of the material that we have provided Ukraine isn't being stored appropriately, used appropriately, maintained appropriately, and being fought with appropriately. We're just not seeing that happen. But is that a potential risk? It's always a risk.
That's all, folks. Can you answer, John? Hours after Germany and the U.S. announced their plans to provide these tanks to that country, Russia fired a whole bunch of missiles right at Kiev and other Ukrainian cities. The barrage came as Russia claimed it perceived the offer as direct Western involvement in the war. In a sustained and wide-ranging attack, the head of the Ukrainian army said that Moscow launched at least 55 sea-based missiles at Kiev and other cities. There's now a race to get those tanks, as I said, on the battlefield and get everybody trained on how to use them. With main battle tanks from the U.S. and Germany now headed to Ukraine, guess what? Kyiv is now focusing on securing modern jet fighters from the West. Surprise, surprise. What are we going to send our latest F-35s over? Technology nobody's got? No, they just want some F-16s. Ukraine's defense secretary said he's optimistic that they'll get some Western fighter jets like F-16s very soon. He went on to say, every type of weapon we request, we needed it yesterday. We will do everything possible to ensure Ukraine gets fourth-generation fighter jets as soon as possible. So far, the U.S. has resisted and said they will not send F-16s. But as I just told you, last fall, the regime said they wouldn't send tanks. Which brings us to our next guest, former advisor to Defense Secretary under President Trump, our pal Colonel Doug Macregor, who, by the way, just wrote an article about all this. You should check it out in the American Conservative. This time is different. Neither we nor our allies are prepared to fight an all-out war with Russia, regionally or globally. In the article, Colonel discusses how Washington's proxy war against Russia is failing. And I agree. Even though if you say that, you're pro-Russia. No, you're not. You're being factual. You're telling the truth. The Colonel states that neither we nor our allies are prepared to fight an all-out war with Russia. And Americans should not be surprised if war breaks out between Russia and the U.S. That scares the hell out of me, folks. It should you too. Let's have the Colonel come on now and weigh in, not only on the article, but on this latest revelation of sending tanks when the regime said we wouldn't send tanks. which leads me to believe, Colonel, we'll probably send fighters next. What are you hearing?
Well, Dan, you know, it's hard to argue against you. This is farcical, let's be frank, because Ukrainian military power is disintegrating in front of us right now. They're on their last legs. They've been through 12 rounds of mobilization. They're pushing people at gunpoint into uniform. They've taken 400,000 casualties as a minimum.
Wow.
There are perhaps somewhere between 18 and 22 million people left in Ukraine out of a population of 37.5 million. 10 million refugees, 4 or 5 million living in the areas that are under Russian control, where, of course, the people are Russians anyway. And then 2 million working overseas in the European Union and Great Britain. So the population is not what it was, and 400,000 casualties is a very heavy burden for 18 to 22 million. And most of these casualties will never recover and return to the battlefield. And of that number, remember 157,000 dead and counting. 75% of all the casualties taken by the Ukrainians result from Russian artillery systems, rockets, missiles, shells. The Russians can fire 60,000 rounds a day. The Ukrainians are barely able to fire 6,500 in return. This is a farce. We've now promised these people tanks that won't arrive for months. And the German chancellor is foolish to even sign on for this nonsense. He should have stuck with his guns. Now his foreign minister says, we're in a state of war with Russia. Imagine the foreign minister of Germany saying that Germany is in a state of war with Russia. Scholz is not long for his job, I think. About 63% of the Germans were polled and said, we don't support sending anything to Russia.
Wow.
So I think this farce is coming to an end. And I imagine, Dan, that the argument will be, well, you know, we did all we could. We sent them everything we could, and it just didn't work.
Colonel,
the truth is we've destroyed Ukraine.
You list these numbers, and these are numbers I don't hear anywhere in the mainstream media. Is that because the government doesn't release them? These journalists are lazy and don't do their research? How do we not have these facts out there on the big three, ABC, NBC, CBS, saying this is the reality of what's happening in this war, folks?
Well, you know, Dan, that unlike you and some people at Fox, a few over there, the rest of the media is basically handed a narrative that comes straight out of the Department of Defense, the CIA, and the White House, and the State Department. And the narrative says, this is what you're going to say. This is Putin's war. This is an unprovoked attack by the Russians. It's all nonsense. We spent years provoking them, and the numbers that I'm citing to you are very accurate. And as people are looking at the demographics, they're figuring out where we're headed because, you know, in addition to everything I just told you, the birth rate is the lowest in Europe in Ukraine. I mean, we're literally killing this nation by pushing them forward into this war. So the only real rational explanation we can come up with here in the United States is this is a scam to transfer wealth to donors for people on the Hill, wealth to the industries.
Yep. You've heard me say it. It's a money laundering scheme. 30 seconds left. There was a tweet that President Trump put out, your former commander-in-chief you worked for, about what's happening here. First come the tanks, then come the nukes. Get this crazy war ended now. So easy to do. 30 seconds. How do you end it quickly like Trump's claiming, Colonel?
What you have to do is say we're going to hold an immediate ceasefire. We'll hold talks without preconditions and sit down with the Russians and hammer out a solution. They're willing to do that. They're not interested in carrying this war forward to the West. So Trump is absolutely right. And if we don't do this, there's always the danger that as everything collapses, someone in Washington will say, well, let's send in our troops with the Poles and the Romanians and try to hold on to what we can in Western Ukraine. That is a disaster. We cannot do that.
Colonel Doug Macregor, as always, we value your insight and your intelligence briefings. You're still getting somewhere because you're bringing the facts and the truth to our viewers. Thank you, sir. We appreciate you. Take care.
Sure. Thanks, Dan.
Yep.